Hey guys, it's TI Kevin83 here, and what I want to give you today is a deep dive into an aspect of a hobby I've picked up over the last year called astrophotography. And before we get too much into that, I want to give you the background a little bit of how I got into this and how it kind of relates to some of the experience I've had with speedrunning. So, if you remember a few years ago, I built a tech demo website called RGB Scaler. And if I play this here, this tech demo is an example of how to preserve retro video game footage with maximum sharpness on the web. And it does that by using specific algorithms tuned for retro video archival footage and specific ways of storing the video footage and scaling it on the browser for the end user. So you might not necessarily be able to see it as sharp as I'm seeing it here on your screen, but if you were to go to the same website, it would scale the footage exactly for your screen and give you all the same benefits that I'm getting it watching it here. And this is just some Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles speedrun footage that is being shown from the NES game that kind of demonstrates how we can preserve that sharpness of the footage. So, in order to make the site, I had to learn a lot of detail about how images work, how video compression works, how image artifacts work, right? So I started watching YouTube videos and got really deep into watching videos about astrophotography. And that's where I got into doing it myself. And I'm going to talk through first some techniques that I've been discovering and learning about over the last few weeks and months, and a technical deep dive into how they work. And then I'm going to show a bit about the application actually using them live, and then some of the outputs I've gotten in my images. So, first off, we have a problem about how to recover detail in Astro images. Depending on the combination of a camera and lens or telescope, your image may be oversampled or undersampled. And in an oversampled image, you have way too many camera pixels for each bit of detail that the lens is producing. So all of that detail is getting spread out over many pixels, way more than you actually need to fully resolve the detail the lens is capturing. And this can happen in a couple scenarios. It could be that you just have a less perfectly manufactured lens, it has some aberrations, or it might be that the lens is out of focus slightly, or that it just can't focus all the colors at the same time, or you could have all those things perfect but have really bad seeing conditions where the atmosphere is just really blurry for that day. So even though you've got all everything figured out, the image just happens to be blurrier that day because the atmosphere is really turbulent, or maybe there's high humidity, or a number of other possible factors that could give you an oversampled image. On the flip side of an oversampled image, you have an undersampled image. And that's where you don't have enough camera pixels to capture all of the possible resolution that a lens could provide. This could happen with very wide angle, very sharp telescopes like the SQA55 telescope that I use when paired with most commercial, especially color cameras. And the effective resolution of a lens is called its resolving power, often measured in line pairs per millimeter. So there's a chart at the top here. It's like an instrument that would be used to measure a telescope's line pairs per millimeter, or lens's lines pairs per millimeter, by holding it in front of the lens and seeing at which point various line pairs blur into just being gray instead of separate lines. The sensor resolution on a camera that you need to fully capture the resolution of the lens relates by the Nyquist-Shannon theorem. Just like for audio, you need double the frequency of audio to capture all the possible frequencies that you can hear. You need double the number of pixels to capture all the detail you can see. Okay? So, moving on from there, in oversampled images, we have some new stacking techniques that mainly serve to reduce some artifacts introduced by interpolating pixels. And we'll talk a bit about why you might need to interpolate pixels because of bayering in just a minute and what bayering is. And those artifacts can disappear with downsampling to an appropriate resolution for the lens's resolving power, especially with the use of these new techniques. In undersampled images, however, because there is extra information available, then these techniques not only can help smooth out the artifacts introduced from previous techniques, but also can give us additional resolution. So let's talk about that. What are the two algorithms I'm talking about? One of them is interpolation, and the other is Drizzle. Interpolation was the existing algorithm that Siril used, and it uses de-bayered images. We'll explain bayering and de-bayering in just a second. And this interpolation method helps maximize signal to noise ratio recovery in exchange for greater difficulty recovering fine details. And sometimes this can be necessary to use interpolation if you have extremely small data sets, or when your data isn't properly dithered or dithered every frame. Dithering being when you have a device like an ASIR or a program like Nina on your computer and a guide scope on your telescope, helping to keep your camera perfectly tracked to a certain set of stars or area of the sky. And then every time you take an image, shifting it slightly to cover a different set of pixels. That way, missing pixels, like rejected ones from having hot pixels, get just smoothed out in the final image. And Drizzle is the new algorithm that Siril has access to. And instead of debayering the image, it directly lays into the stack the Bayer patterned images. And this maximizes detail recovery in exchange for greater difficulty preserving the signal to noise ratio. So you have a little bit noisier of an image potentially, but you'll have really, really fine detail recovery, especially if you follow some of the techniques that I'm going to show. So let's get into some more detail about the old image registration process, because it's going to explain bayering and why this is so important to know about for the differences of when you want to use one of these two different algorithms. So in the old image registration set, you would use the pre-processed images with your dark bias flat corrections, but you would use debayered versions. And debayering is the process of taking the image that is on your camera sensor, and that's what is being shown in the upper right of the presentation here, where you have a series of filters on different sets of pixels. So some pixels are going to be only red, some pixels are going to receive only blue, and some pixels are going to receive only green. And we're going to receive double in green than red or blue, because mainly things related to how daytime images would normally go. For nighttime astro images, you don't really want green as much, but that's not the point here. So normal Bayer patterns end up 1 red, 1 blue, and 2 green. Now, a full color resolution image can be reconstructed from that, resulting in an image where 3 out of every 4 pixels are interpolated, because you need to fill in the blue here, blue here, blue here, and the red here, red here, red here. So for the red and the blue, 3 out of every 4 subpixels are interpolated, and for the green, half of them end up interpolated. And the algorithm that Siril uses for this is specially tuned for recovery of round objects. It's aware that it should be preserving round details like stars, and uses debayering to try to interpolate and guess what should be between red pixels for creating round objects. And this interpolated full resolution then enables us to do further interpolation instead of aliasing and gaps when we create our final stack. So we have a full grid of pixels from the debayering. Like, you might see that this image in the bottom left is a debayered example image. So the top one is the Bayer patterned image, and the bottom one is the reconstructed debayered image. And if you then have a whole bunch of astro images, like the bottom one, and stack them, they're going to be from different points in the sky, either from doing the dithering where you're intentionally moving it, or just because your telescope is drifting slowly. So you need to move those, called registration, to be perfectly over top of each other. And the process of doing that then is going to mean that your interpolated pixels can be further interpolated to guess which values need to be when you shift images onto the stack. And when you do that, it's just going to mean that you have tons and tons of interpolation going on, because not only is the input image have 3 out of 4 of every pixel interpolated in 2 of the color dimensions and half in the green one, you're then doing additional interpolation to shift the pixels on top of each other for resolution. So this just like really limits the recovery of the telescope's full resolving power if you are undersampled, because so much of the data that's being stacked in is guesses about what should be between pixels. So a problem related to this is aliasing, and I just want to explain quick what aliasing is and a little bit about how it relates to this process. So aliasing, or moire, is a problem where images in the overlaying of grids without sufficient resolution creates undesirable noise patterns. In the example below, this is caused by the interference between the pixel grid of your camera, or the image here, and the grid shapes of the bricks on the wall. So on the left image, there's enough pixels to separate the bricks distinctly, and on the right image, there's not enough pixels, and then we see this moire pattern in the right side of the wall. So in debayering, the interpolated pixels are a kind of aliasing, but it's not the kind that looks like sharp, like the video game over sharpness you might see sometimes if you aren't anti-aliasing a video game. It's not that kind of aliasing here. This is more like an overly smooth aliasing, where if I go back, you can see that the black parts of this image have like red and green and blue fringes on the sides of them, because there's like an over smoothing of the colors beyond their intended boundaries. So in drizzle stacking, in the new algorithm, we'll see a different kind of aliasing, which results in smaller and sharper artifacts, but also then allows us to recover more resolution. So what is this new technique, drizzle? So instead of debayering the input image, we rely on those dithering shifts I talk about, where we're intentionally moving the camera around to different points, observing the object. And we use that to fill in the entire image and all the gaps from the Bayer grid with actual data instead of guesses. And this allows us to trade off one set of color aliasing, those guesses, for the actual data that just is maybe a little bit overly smooth with nearby data. Because if I imagine if you image one pixel and then image the nearby area but slightly covering that one, it's going to be kind of average with that area and the previous one. So you're not going to get the exact information to fill in, but you're going to get a little bit closer to it because it's got that data just averaged into the data to the side of it. So with enough data, you can then fully reconstruct the available image. And the real necessity and key here is, like I said, the dithering every frame to give you a different registration point to fill in data. And it requires having enough frames to cover at least every output point at least once. Otherwise, you're going to see much worse artifacts than you would see from any other kind of process. So this heavily benefits from that dithering. And yeah, it allows us to not have to do the interpolation. So, but like I said, there's still aliasing effects, because you don't fully get away with the registration process. You have to pick some place to put the data. Imagine you've got this dot here, and you need to register it onto the fine output grid. And this is a image directly from the original paper that described drizzle reconstruction. On the left, you have a dot from your input pixel, and it needs to go out onto the output pixel grid here. It has the nearest neighbor fill in one of those pixels to use, so you're going to have some aliasing in which of those pixels it chooses to use. Maybe the output pixel is halfway between 2 pixels, so it's going to choose, okay, maybe it's a little bit closer to halfway to one side, so it ends up effectively aliasing it to that pixel, when really if it were anti-aliased, it'd say, okay, like, I'm going to drop it half in this pixel and half in the other pixel. And it can't do that because you need to nearest neighbor sample these droplets to be used for rejection statistics. So, for example, if we did say, okay, this pixel 33% covered this output pixel and 66% covered this other output pixel, then when we went to figure out, okay, this pixel here from an input image was 3 standard deviations off all the other pixels, let's reject that. Well, that it's not actually 3 standard deviations off. It's just it was only imaged for a third of the time that the other pixels were. So unless you account for that, you can't use it in rejection statistics. So we can't do anti-aliasing in the registration process. We have to do nearest neighbor stacking. So we want to register the data at a much higher output resolution, register at a higher output scale, and then do the anti-aliasing at the after the stack time effect, so that you can still do that de-aliasing of the registration process. Okay, so the additional benefit of doing this super sampled stacking, is what I'm calling it, is there is anti-aliasing of the color channels in re-registration. So in any image, but especially images with severe chromatic aberration, the effects of telescope lenses cause light at different wavelengths to land at slightly different points on your image sensor. By splitting and then re-registering the color channels, the chromatic aberration can be lessened by moving those colors to as if they were actually imaged exactly on top of each other. However, the realignment of that causes yet another opportunity for aliasing, because you have to interpolate and guess, okay, we need to move this pixel half a pixel to the right. Well, you can't really do that. We got to average out, move things around a little bit. So doing this re-registration of the pixels at a higher super sampled resolution and then downsampling can have the effect of anti-aliasing not just the registration process of the original data, but the re-registration of the color channels to help with chromatic aberration. And I talked a little bit about earlier how the downside of this idea of drizzle and super sampling is in signal to noise ratio preservation. So one of the things it talks about in the docs for the new Siril version is that a common way of doing drizzle stacking is to register at a scale and then the pixel fraction inverse of the scale. So you might say, going back to the example here, the red lines are your original pixel sizes and the blue sizes are the pixel fractions. So we want to reduce the pixels by and sort of concentrate them to a smaller output point. And this can help with the recovery of resolution in the lens. However, if you do that during the registration, it will mean that you have a worse signal to noise ratio, because all of these other points between the red and the blue that would have been receiving information if you were scaling up and not then drop shrinking the pixels are not receiving any information from that image for this registration. So over the effects of all of the images, if you, let's say for a 3 times scale factor, is an example of the largest one you can use right now in Siril. If you were to use a reciprocal pixel fraction of 0.33, then that would mean you would have 3 times less signal in both dimensions, or effectively a 9 times worse signal to noise ratio, which you really don't want. I think it might be like root 9 or something, but the point is it's a much worse signal to noise ratio, because you're effectively talking about having smaller pixels. And Deep Sky Detail just did a great video on this about how there's a relation between larger pixels and better signal to noise ratio. So there's always going to be trade-offs between trying to recover detail and resolution and the signal to noise ratio of the final image, or the fidelity of the image and like noisiness. So This can be worked around, however, by not drop shrinking the pixels, just upping the scale and having the output points be covered scale times in both dimensions for each input pixel. So you can still get all the value out of the upscaling of the registration process to reduce the aliasing that registration with nearest neighbor interpolation would cause, but also allow, again, the nearest neighbor allowing the rejection statistics to still work by treating every point as if it were imaged for the same amount of time, and on top of all of that, giving you just the full signal to noise ratio benefits out of every output point. The only downside of that then is that you just need more data to recover the gaps between images, because that those gap bits are going to be smoothed out more with the surrounding ones and averaged out a little bit harder. So uh, again, with the anti-aliasing color channel re-registration, I'm going to just point out and make sure I show this quick before I move on, the benefit of this re-registration of the color channels. You can see in the bottom, there's a red tinge to the bottom left of the star and a blue tinge to the top right. And after re-registering the image's color channels, that tinge is still there. You can't completely eliminate it, but it's not nearly as severe because the red, blue, and green are more evenly stacked on top of each other. So now that I've gone through and talked through the differences between the interpolation and the drizzle stacking, I'm going to show you live what happens when you do drizzle stacking in the new Siril, and provide some just examples to also show the Siril devs some quirks that I've been running into with the process here. So I'm going to go rehome to this folder here for testing, grab my testing data, and I'm going to go do a registration. We'll start out at scale size of 1 and pixel fraction of 1. This would be the defaults, and I would just use the droplet model square here too. So let's go register, and we can see the output. It's a little interesting because we have red, green, and blue in every output point. And I would not expect that for scale 1 pixel fraction 1. I would expect for scale 1 pixel fraction 1 that the output points have, and I think we can see it actually if we look at the frame list here, that I would expect this, that the third frame has, where there's a red with no green or blue, there's a green, and then there's a blue with no red or green. And this is showing the Bayer pattern of the original image. Like I said, we are, instead of trying to de-Bayer and recover color for every output point, we are directly registering the colors that were provided by the input points. So there's 1 pixel green, 1 pixel red, 1 pixel blue, 1 pixel green for every quadrant of input pixels. But again, this is a little weird. The pixel fraction, when you use scale 1 and pixel fraction 1, the pixel fraction seems to be different for one of the output images than the others. And the one that is most often is what I would not expect for a pixel fraction of 1. So I did some more research and digging into how to use the pixel fraction, and if we go back to testing sequence and do a registration, instead of with scale 1, let's do scale 2 and pixel fraction 0.5 and go register. We can see now if we zoom in that the output points have, and if you've watched the X and Y values, 1, X increases by 1, so 2, Y increases by 1, 3, X increases by 1, 4. So there's 4 output points now for each input pixel, and 4 for green, 4 for blue, and so on. And we can see if we zoom out and zoom around, like here, there's some aliasing because the image had to be warped a little bit to register perfectly. So at this little seam here, there's a little bit of aliasing going on. And it's the size of a quarter of an input pixel. So, what if I wanted to make that a little bit less? So this is what I was talking about, the benefits of registering at higher and higher scales. So if I go up to testing register at scale 3, pixel fraction 0.67, and go register. Now, if I zoom into those areas, the error of having to warp this area here to make it fit properly is at the size of a third of a pixel in both dimensions. So this just keeps progressively getting smaller and smaller as we go into registering with higher scales. Now, I've modified Siril here to allow scales higher than 3 for the purpose of this video. So you guys won't necessarily be able to do this at home yet unless you download the specific version from my GitLab. But just to show here, again, at pixel fraction 0.75 and scale 4, if you zoom in, now the artifacts are only a quarter of a pixel in both dimensions from having to use a nearest neighbor method there. So you just get a lot of benefits out of using higher scales and with using what I'm calling an identity pixel fraction, where the pixel fraction is scale times in both dimensions the input pixels. So there's two weird things that I'm pointing out here. First is if I go back to testing, there's at scale 1 and pixel fraction 1, we're seeing, if we look at the frame list, frame 3 is what we expect from a pixel fraction of 1, where we have one input dot for every output dot. And 2 and 1 are acting like the pixel fraction is maybe 2. I think it's acting like it's scale plus 1 over scale. Because if we then go to register with going to testing, registration, scale 2, pixel fraction 0.5, and click go register, we now get, for this image, 1, 2, 3, 4 output dots. So to scale 2 times in both dimensions. And again, I would expect a pixel fraction of 1 to give that behavior, but we're instead having to do it with 0.5 because the pixel fraction is actually acting like scale plus 1 over scale is the identity transform, or scale minus 1 over scale is what I have to put in for the pixel fraction to get that identity behavior that I would expect out of a pixel fraction 1. So going back then to like a scale of 6, we would need a pixel fraction of 0.83. If I register that, now if I look at our little zigzag areas here, some of this aliasing from having to warp the image is only at the scale of a sixth of a pixel in both dimensions instead of a third or a quarter or half of a pixel in both dimensions. And what I'm doing for my images is, this is not my original camera sensor. You can see it's a crop in. So this is something that is being worked on for Siril 1.4. I put in a suggestion and they immediately are working. So I really appreciate the Siril devs and everything they're doing building this stuff. If I go back to my testing sequence, you can see the original image is 1700 by 1000, about 1700 by 1000. And that's because I've cropped into this section of the image in sequence. And you can do that by highlighting a portion of an image, right-clicking, crop, and crop sequence. And if you were to do that in the beta right now, that'd be a little risky because it's not aware of the Bayer pattern in color images. So if you zoom in here, you would need to really make sure that you're cropping like, oh, I think the Bayer colors fit there better, because you can see like green and green would match better. So that's probably green there. And then you'd have to do that for each corner. So it's really monotonous to try to do right now. But they are fixing that in the Siril 1.4 branch. So thank you, Siril devs. They will now make it so that when you crop, it crops to an exact multiple of your Bayer sensor. So, but what I'm doing is I'm doing that crop like I have here, and then I'm doing a scale of as big as like 12 and a pixel fraction of 0.91. And then when I register that, it takes a little bit longer. So I'll have to sit here for a second while it does that, and I can get a sip of my water for the rest of the talk. And now when we zoom in, the errors involved in dropping the output droplets are the size of a 1/12 of a pixel instead of a 1/6 of a pixel. And we had to do a little bit smaller on the small side. We're doing a 0.91. If you do 0.92, they start to overlap a little bit. So it's a little bit tricky, especially with what I was talking about, where currently the pixel fraction has that weird behavior where it's not a pixel fraction of 1 to get an identity. It's a scale minus 1 over scale. So you have to try to put in 0.9167 or something, but you can only do it to 2 decimal places. So you end up getting a little bit more artifacting even then. So, but we'll get that figured out with the Siril devs. Hopefully now with this video, we can show and get that even better. So moving on from there, if I go back to like a really basic one, like a scale 2 pixel fraction 0.5, and register this, then I'll stack it, and we can see this is what I was talking about here, where you don't want to do this method if you only have 3 frames or something like this. You really need probably 16, 32 input frames, something in that range to start to make this technique work, because you need every output point to be hit in every color. And that is only going to happen if you're dithering or if your telescope is drifting naturally and you just happen to accidentally get every spot filled in. So you can see here, like, we didn't get red or green in this spot. We didn't get red in this spot. We didn't get blue in this spot. We didn't get red or blue in this spot. So you really need to have every point covered in every color for this technique to work. And you can see it causes some really bad color moire if you don't. Now, with that, I want to show some of the benefits of then reducing the image size back from 12 down to a more reasonable, something like 3 times. So I'm going to go open up in my Whale Galaxy data. I did a stack at 3 times of this data. And I'm going to zoom in to a part of the image over here that has some small stars. Yeah, this is a great area. So you can see this is the 3 times stack. There's a lot of grid noise. You can see there's like a grid here going on. There's a grid here going on. Grids. There's lots of little like dots and freckles of grids in the noise. And if let's just snip this and put it to the side so we can do a more direct comparison. And also let's crop that other star in there too, so we can put to the side. And wow, that grid really starts to come out when you have it looking like that. Now I compare that against a SSAA Super-Sampled Anti-Aliasing version, where I didn't stack this image at 3 times. I stacked it at 12 times and then went into geometry resample, and I put in a X scale and Y scale of 25% and used the pixel area relation algorithm to average the pixels together. So we closed that. Imagine I did that to this stack though. And if we go look in at the same parts of the image, let's see, what one did I grab here? It was like a star that was, this part here, and zoom in here. Okay. There's a lot of these grids still here, but they're also significantly lessened in the noise background. So you can kind of still see a bit of it here, where we saw that on the right side here. And let's scale it back up so we're not cheating with the size difference. But you can see also this star looks much more distinct, and this one as well. And its shape is a little bit improved from the ones on the right. And if we really zoom in, and I'll have to flip over to the other one and grab a crop zoomed in too, but these pixel dots on the upper right where we have some more color in like the magenta, it is more towards the star's proper color than in the native 3 times stack. So we've both kind of lessened out some of the grid noise in the background and lessened out some of the color artifacting around the fringes of stars. And now it kind of looks like a minor difference here doing a direct comparison in the auto stretch of the stacks. But where this becomes really, really major is when you start to hit AI processing techniques like blur exterminator and noise exterminator. Because while to our eyes, these patterns look like noise, to a denoising algorithm or to a deblurring algorithm, those patterns look more like patterns. And so, especially also trying to like use the signal to noise ratio tests you can do. Like if you grab here and do a click on a star, you can get an estimation of the signal to noise ratio in that area. Or you could like click on this one, signal to noise ratio 23.1. This is not a great way of estimating the improvement of this super-sampled anti-aliasing, because a blind algorithm will not see those background patterns as noise. They will see them as signal or structure. It would be much harder for like an algorithm to detect that those grid patterns are noise and not structure. They're going to see them as the signal and treat them like they're good in the algorithm. So even though I've actually seen very tiny improvements in the SNR, I was surprised to even see that, because I would think that a naive algorithm would detect those background aliasing patterns as structure or signal. So I would say it's not terribly useful. Also because the photometry is only being done in the green channel. It's not a all color cross comparison. And some of this is an interference between the color channels and the aliasing effects that has. So I don't think the photometry does an amazing estimate of showing how beneficial this is, but we can still visually observe that those patterns are lessened. So moving on from there, I wanted to pull up an example, an actual comparison of why this is so important. So this is in data that this is even like not supposed to be that good for. This was 32 images. Actually, it wasn't even 32. It was 22 images from a non-guided camera. So we're not intentionally moving the camera around to get it covering all the positions for the Bayer pattern. It just happened to drift in that direction for us. And we still were able to use the Drizzle algorithm because we used that 2 times scale half pixel fraction, or 12x 0.91 pixel fraction, that gives you that identity fraction. When I did that here, we got this result for the 2 times direct scale, and this result for the 8 times scale, but then downscaled 4 times for a 4 times super sample effect. And it's really hard to tell directly here with just an auto stretch that there's any difference at all, even. But when you start to zoom in, you can start to see the differences. There's a lot of color fringing in the gaps of the diffraction spikes of the star, and there's a little bit less of it. There still is. I'm not saying there's none of it. It doesn't completely fix it, but it's kind of smoothed out the edges of the diffraction spikes and smoothed out a little bit of the color noise in the gaps between the diffraction spikes. And where this really comes in, like I was saying, is that the AI tools, they see these grid patterns as structure, like I was expecting the signal to noise ratio algorithm to see. So when you use blur exterminator and noise exterminator on an image that is drizzle stacked but not at a higher resolution, it can start to pull out those details as structure and enhance them when they're not actually detail, they're artifacts. But if we instead do this super sampled registration and downsampling back to the size we want to use in processing, blur exterminator doesn't notice those little differences. And a noise exterminator might actually think of them as noise instead of signal because they're so lessened, and help blur them out. So on Alnitak, where before we were getting basically the inability to saturate the star at all without getting artifacts, now we can saturate the star, get some great blues in it around the edges, and not get nearly as much. Still a little bit. Again, this is not a complete fix. We can't completely fix all these issues from color cameras, but we can lessen them through these super sampling techniques. So that kind of covers a lot of that. Let's show quick too just some of the outputs. And this is the part of the the presentation where Astro Backyard or Nebula Photos or someone, they might start putting some really dramatic music over the background. I don't have that kind of production value here. So we're just going to show you some of the results I've got. This is the Markarian chain with 7.5 hours of imaging time on the SQ855. And when we zoom in, we can see a lot of detail in the eyes galaxy here. We can see some of the H alpha clouds. If you see images that are done in SHO, you can tell that these clouds here are very H alpha intense, and you can see a lot of the color structure in the center of the eyes galaxy. You can go over here. You can see a lot of structure in these galaxies. There's a lot of cool spiral structure. We can see a great barred spiral here. Just all tons of great, very fine structure detail visible. Great structure detail visible here as well. And again, here with some maybe background galaxies or stars on the edge there too. That's very interesting. There's just tons of galaxies with tons of detail in this Markarian image. And one of the things I loved about the Markarian image here was also recovering the black hole jet stream from M87. So this is M87, the black hole that was imaged to use the Event Horizon Telescope to directly observe the shadow of a black hole, and then we recovered the jet stream at a telescope that is only imaging at 264 millimeters of focal length. You can see some structure in the galaxies here too, and again, like I was saying, we're something called undersampled, right? Like the original color camera resolution here is 3008 by 3008. This is a stack done at 3 times in both dimensions. I think this one was 6 times and then downsampled by 2 to get that anti-aliasing effect. And we're seeing details here that are literally like a pixel or 2 wide. So like we're actually recovering detail that is smaller than the individual camera sensor pixels with this technique. So really, really enjoying the Markarian chain. Let's just flip over to the Whale Galaxy as well. It has a whale, right? We got tons of great detail in the Whale Galaxy. Little purple bits of nebulosity, orange bits here. The Companion Galaxy, and also the hockey stick down here with great bits of nebulosity through here. And you can see that there is a decent amount of noise exterminator used in this, so some of the nebulosity looks a little bit overly smeary to me. I would give a criticism myself of that hopefully as I get longer and longer exposure times with some of this, that we can use noise exterminator a little more lightly, and then hopefully resolve even more detail and not have to use noise exterminator quite as much. So but anyway, still very, very happy about this outcome, and then being able to use noise exterminator and not get those artifacts like we were seeing previously. So yeah, this is amazing. And this is the Pinwheel Galaxy in narrowband, using a dual narrowband filter, and with this was also with like a 70 to 80% moon on the nights I was shooting. So absolutely crazy that we're able to recover this much of the H alpha detail. Really, I'm when I use this, I want to eventually combine it with broadband detail and just throw away the blue and green channels and only use the H alpha. But you can see, like down here, the red here is only 2 to 3 pixels wide in many spots, and we're still recovering that spiral H alpha signal, despite we're imaging at a pixel that is like a size of 3 of these, right? So these tiny details of only a pixel or 2 wide are smaller than the camera sensor's pixels because of the abilities of this super sampled drizzle stacking, and the abilities of blur exterminator and noise exterminator when combined with those techniques. So lastly, I wanted to talk about a sort of like future theory I have. One of the things that I'm doing a little bit weird with my stacking technique here, if I go to my registered image, when I do my stacking now, I am using no weighting and no normalization. I will use rejection with the normal winsorized clipping algorithm, but I do not use normalization or weighting when I'm building these images now. I want to use output normalization, RGB equalization in my images, but I'm not using normalization or weighting. And that's because if we zoom in here, imagine if for one image we weighted this red hotter, and the next image we weighted it lower, and it was registered where the green one is. I'll just shift it off a little bit. Well, if we weight them, then the red's going to be more intense for that image and less intense for the other image. And it's going to exaggerate the aliasing effect of the interference of the registration of the two images. So I'm not entirely sure how Siril accommodates for that. So I'm just not using normalization and weighting until I can confirm with the devs that they are accounting for it. And I have a technique that I've written up that I think should be able to account for it that I'll just talk through here as well. So the question would be whether they're doing something like this already. I haven't been able to read the Siril code. I don't read C very well. My native development language is TypeScript, usually, which is what I wrote to demonstrate this algorithm. But in the original paper for the Drizzle stacking algorithm, it was created for the Hubble telescope. And in that paper, they don't talk much about the aliasing or moire interference that the algorithm causes. And I showed that a bit, actually, when I showed the Markarian image and I zoomed in here on the black hole. You can see, even with all the techniques we're doing, we have still not completely eliminated color moire. There's still a little bit of color interference in the grid patterns in this galaxy. The little blue jet there, that's not interference. That's the actual black hole jet appearing. But there's just tiny bands of slightly different color in the core of the galaxy. And that's just, it's just the nature of the algorithm. But I've written this example here to try to give an idea of how I might minimize the impact of that. So the idea would be to sort of take the images and do a sub-pixel level normalization. So one of the checks here at the end of the stacking process is RGB equalization, to take the input images and sort of say, okay, I know that the green was observed 4 times, or 2 times for every one time the red was observed, one for one time the blue was observed, or kind of like say, okay, the whole green is this value on average and the whole red is this value on average across the whole image. So I'm going to sort of equalize the 3 to kind of balance them out a little bit and kind of get you closer to a color balanced image. Well, I had a thought, okay, why not instead count up every time each color is observed in the Bayer droplets, and then use that sort of counting to develop a map of the aliasing or moire pattern, and then subtract that out of the final image. Now, I do think that Siril is basically effectively doing this already in its algorithm. The more I've researched into it, the more I think they're doing at least a basic version of this, where like as you get each droplet dot in, it's adding it in such a way that is averaging it into the data and not causing it to have a more pattern as exaggerated as this would be. But what I thought of was, okay, what about with normalization and weighting? So normalization and weighting could be increasing those more artifacts. If we just say, for instance, like the red dots in this image are coming from images that were registered more often in one location. Well, what if those are weighted heavier and now the red dots are even more intense in the artifacting? So what I thought was, okay, what if instead of just trying to count the output dots, we instead registered a corresponding Bayer map for each input image? So we said, okay, for each input image, here's the actual like values of the pixels registered in, but then also here is the map of not the values of the pixels, but just that this is a red 1, this is a blue 1, this is a green 1, and this is where they went on the output image. And then you could sum all of that together and divide it out of the final stack, right? So that's how you get this map, is the registration of those pattern maps and then the stacking of the pattern maps. So where this comes in for weighting and normalization of the backgrounds is the pattern maps are going to get more different too if you also apply the weighting to them. So what I think you could actually do to really enable weighting and normalization with this technique, and again, maybe this is already being done. I'm making sure I have a place with this site, the GitHub image stack simulation, a place to document the concept here, would be, okay, again, you image the galaxy, you have the corresponding Bayer pattern map that is just the locations of red, green, and blue, and not the values. You register both of those things, the values and the pattern map. But then if you also applied the weighting and rejection and background normalization to both the pattern map and the real image, then when you stack together the pattern map and then divide out the pattern map stack, you would also be able to divide out the excess effects on the MAR grids of the scaling and weighting of the images. So I think that's where we need to check next with Siril as well, is that accounted for in how they add together the images, that, okay, we're adding this point, but we're also adding it with a weighting intensity, so we need to know to then divide that out of the color more. So thanks for watching today, guys. That's really all I have. Again, I'm just super excited about using the super sampled technique I've developed here with Siril. I'm glad I could show you guys all the stuff I'm doing and some images. If you're interested in seeing more of my images, you can check out my page, astrobin.com/users/TIKevin83. And you can always check out more on my channel. Hopefully I'll make some more videos just talking about some of the stuff I'm imaging, some of the cool targets I've gotten, some of the cool things we're doing with our club. And I'll have more speedrunning content as well. I am talking about speedrunning for the Brew City Code, I think it's actually Beer City Code Festival in August in Grand Rapids. And I'm also talking about the T3 Boy speedrunning emulator that I developed for the browser at React Summit in Amsterdam in June. I won't be there, but I've recorded a remote talk for them for that. So really exciting, lots of stuff going on. Thank you guys so much for watching a little bit of my astrophotography journey and taking a deep dive with me into the details of how to use Siril's new Drizzle technique. And you guys, I hope, have a great day.